Afternoon, everyone. We're just taking a couple of minutes to allow our participants to get into the webinar, and we're going live on Facebook as well at the same time. So I will take a couple of minutes of riffing here before we actually get going, and I'll just say thank you to everybody for joining us, and please have a moment of patience. I think the numbers are slowing down a little bit, so I'll look to get started now, I think. Good, terrific. Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Jeremy Benamy, the president of J Street, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. We have had a number of opportunities over the last couple of weeks in this really horrific time to come together as a community and try to grapple with some of the questions that this crisis poses for all of us. Some of them are matters of policy and strategy. Some of them are more related to security and tactics. Our goal with this webinar actually is to focus in on some of the strategic questions that Israel faces and some of the military challenges and security challenges that it faces as it contemplates next steps as relates to the response to the horrific attack on October 7th and its consequences. We were hoping to be joined by Congressman Jason Crow, who is a member of Congress from Colorado, a longtime friend of J Street, a veteran of the Iraq War, who saw combat in the dense urban populated areas in Iraq that the U.S. military successfully cleared of ISIS control. Even though ISIS still exists, ISIS was never, quote unquote, eradicated, but the control of ISIS of civilian populations was cleared. And Jason has a lot of insight into lessons learned. And I know there are a lot of American officials who are now in Israel, generals, three-star generals now who were back in the day, company commanders and platoon leaders in some of that fighting that are trying to impart some of that wisdom. Unfortunately, Jason has votes on the floor of the House and won't be able to join in the course of this hour. We're going to reschedule for next week with him because I do believe he has a lot to contribute to the conversation. But we're really fortunate to be joined by two wonderful Israeli experts who have spent a lot of time in the strategic field for Israel. I'll introduce them in a second and turn to them. I did want to state up front a word about J Street's positions in this moment of this awful conflict. I'll just start by saying up front, just once again, just how deeply pained everybody in J Street is by what has been happening over the last 2.5 weeks. We start from this position of deep connectivity to the people and the state of Israel who have suffered this incredibly grievous blow. And people in J Street, we've lost our family, we've lost friends, our spouses, children, relatives, friends are at the front lines, poised for whatever the orders are that are given by the Israeli military. And so this is a very deeply personal moment for all of us at J Street. And we reiterate our support for the state and the people of Israel, our call immediately for the release of the hostages, many of whom we have personal connections to. And at the same time, we also reiterate our recognition of the enormous calamity that is befalling citizens of Gaza and the humanitarian dimensions of this crisis for those who are non-combatants and are not responsible for what has happened is enormous. And we are asking for, at this point, consideration, as the administration is, of humanitarian pauses, strategic pauses in the fighting to allow the delivery and coordination of necessary aid. This includes water and food and fuel and medicines for the civilian population of Gaza. And we'll talk a little bit about that with our experts. Finally, I'll just add that we have also made an important part of our position a call on the president to use this moment as an opportunity to call for and set a vision for how ultimately we get out of this spiral in the longer term. What is the plan for the day after? The president began to address that yesterday, and I'm going to be asking our panel to talk a bit about his remarks and what are some of the ways we could move forward with that. But let me stop here with the introduction and turn now to our two experts and thank them for joining us. Noah Shusterman-Dvir is the Palestinian and Regional Program Director at MIND, M-I-N-D, Israel, which is a strategic NGO consulting firm for Israeli related national security institutions. She's a foreign policy and national security expert and researcher focused on Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. She is an expert in areas such as the Palestinian arena and particularly the future of Gaza. Nimrod Novik is a member of the Executive Committee of Commanders for Israel Security. He is a fellow at the Israel Policy Forum, former senior advisor on foreign policy to the late Shimon Peres. And in addition to his connectivity in Israeli security and political circles, Nimrod also maintains very close contacts with the Egyptian intelligence community, Jordanian security establishment, Palestinian leadership, Saudi experts, and broad international context. So I think both of them bring incredible expertise to this moment. And I guess where I'd like to start is if I could ask each of you to share with our audience today a bit of your perspective on the options that Israel has. And this is options both strategic and military as it decides on Thursday, October 26th. What is the next step after these 2.5 weeks? What does a ground invasion mean? What does it look like to have a goal? What is the goal of quote unquote eradicating Hamas? Is that really a goal? Is destroying its operational control of Gaza a goal? What do you see as the goal strategically for Israel, and what are the tactical options that it has? Noah, I'll start with you, and Nimrod, I'll turn to you next.
Thank you. So I think we should really start with the goals. And there has been some rephrasing by different politicians on what are exactly the goals. I think the clearest way to actually review them is through what was published by the cabinet, the Israeli decision-making cabinet, which they talked about eradicating military and governance capacities of Hamas. Meaning the day after we finish this war, Hamas would not be a threat to whomever is living in the south of Israel. Not rockets, not not any kind of weapons, but this would be a peaceful place where people can live next to Gaza without feeling any kind of threat to their lives. One of the reasons that this goal is really essential is because at the end of this war, whenever it will end, people need to go back to their homes, and we have 1,400 people who really experienced hell on earth. The stories are, they're chilling. The evidence, the survival stories, really, they went through hell, and people are obviously not going to go back easily to their homes, knowing that this threat is still in some way, just a kilometer away from them. So this is really essential, and it's not only essential for the south of Israel, but it's also essential for the north of Israel, because in the north we have a similar problem with Hezbollah, and I think that's something we'll probably discuss later, but there are many implications on what happens in the north based on what happens, how it unfolds in the south. So this is, I would say, an essential goal. It's also a very difficult one to achieve, because really reaching the last Kalashnikov and the last hand grenade and making sure that Hamas doesn't have any ability to fire rockets, there's a big question of whether or not that's feasible. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see some sort of delay. Also because they're thinking about, okay, so what is the best operation in order to achieve this goal? If this goal is something that's feasible, how can we achieve it? And I foresee three main options. And afterwards, I'll discuss how the captive issue is somehow complicated and everything. So I think massive invasion, that's what the majority of the Israeli public is aiming for and feels that is necessary. I think also it says a lot to the region on what Israel, I mean, this was really not only a line in the sand, but something happened that should have never happened. So the way that Israel reacts to it also sends a message towards our neighbors, whether or not we show strength or we show weakness, because what happened has happened, but then the question is, how do we react? So whether or not this is a massive invasion, and then you gain control of the territory, you have ability to, combat the tunnels and basically find the tunnel shafts, maybe release some of the captives if you haven't released them before. Of course, this obviously complicates everything because there's also a higher option that maybe some of these captives will be injured if you do a massive invasion. There's also the option of more military casualties. So that's one way of going about it. And then the other way is really doing more tactical incursions, which is in a way what's been going on until now. We've seen mostly it's aerial strikes. And then just this morning, the IDF spokesperson talked about how there was an incursion last night with infantry and tanks. So very small scaled operations, which then have the question of, can you achieve your goal with only these small scale operations? Can you really reach the massive? We're talking about 30,000 militants, okay, that we know of, 30,000 Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip. Obviously, we're not going to be able to kill 30,000 militants in the Gaza Strip. But then, okay, so how do you kill the leadership? How do you, especially if the leadership is in the tunnels? Can you do it with incursions? Probably not. And I think the last options, which is, in a way, it's the best option for Israel, but maybe the least option for the Gazan population, is applying civilian pressure. So through humanitarian assistance, and mostly actually the issue of fuel. Yes, fuel is needed for hospitals and for desalination plants, for waterways in the Gaza Strip, but it's also needed for the air compressors for the tunnels. And we know that Hamas is prepared for this invasion. It has a lot of supplies in the tunnels. That actually the IDF spokesperson in Arabic a few days ago revealed that there's a big stockpile of fuel used by Hamas right next to the Rafah border. There has been some evidence also of Hamas stealing fuel from UNRWA that was supposed to be used for humanitarian causes. So the issue of fuel, that's really the weakness point for Hamas. Because whether they have enough fuel for 30 days or for 60 days, at some point, they're going to have to need more fuel in order to continue surviving in their tunnels, and they're going to have to leave the tunnels. So potentially, Israel can continue with the aerial strikes, wait for the tunnels to start emptying, and then do maybe those tactical incursions or massive invasion. But if we want to be able to reach the strategic goal, which is, again, not having any kind of military threat from the Gaza Strip, it will be very difficult to achieve.
So thank you for that overview, perfectly stated in terms of the goals and the options. Nimrod, similar question to you, and perhaps you can pick up on some of the things that Noah's laid out and give us some of your sense on goals and options.
No, I think that Noah covered it very well. I think these are the dilemmas. I must say that I'm pleased with the fact that there are dilemmas, because in the early days, there were no dilemmas. Everything was driven by justifiably blood boiling, but blood boiling is not a very good strategic advice. It is justified, but not for military planning. So there was a uniformity of massive, all-out reoccupation, and even refusal to consider the question of what happens next. I think that phase ended during the visit of, or just after the visit of President Biden, because when Secretary Austin asked that question, and when Secretary Blinken asked it, and when President Biden asked it, the answer was the same. We'll think about it later. Now we focus on winning. With each response like this, the American effort to impress upon the Israelis the need for the military operation to be informed by the objective and the exit strategy and the strategy of the morning after did something. And with the passage of time, we see a serious debate in different schools, each representing one of the three strategies that Noah laid out. My assumption is that even though the presence of an American three-star general and his team in the Israeli Kiryat, in the headquarters of the IDF, who come with experience, just like the congressman that we missed, of doing it in Iraq in person, and have a lot of lessons to share. I think that the IDF did learn much of that, internalize much of these lessons over the past years. And I think that what we will end up seeing is something that reflects lessons drawn from those experiences and others. And I think we'll see something that will be a combination of option 1 and 2 that Noah described. A final word on something that Noah started with, and I want to take it a step further. Initially, as Noah mentioned, every one of our cabinet members had his own creative definition of the end game, of the objective. And that was awful, and that was not serious, and that was not professional. With time, they started to get their act together. Not all of them are there yet. And one thing that was not discussed was what do Palestinian Islamists, where do they go when there is no Hamas? Now, one thing is not going to happen. They're not going to join the Zionist movement. So where are they going to go? So history tells us that after Al-Qaeda, you get ISIS. And who knows how vicious ISIS' successor is going to be. So trying to destroy Hamas the way it was described earlier, that the movement will not exist anymore, was both an illusion and even counterproductive. You don't eradicate an idea, an ideology, and the movement, especially one that exists beyond our borders, beyond our area of control. So narrowing it down to Hamas will not govern Gaza anymore. And there will be no militant, organized militant groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the other 40 smaller splinters in Gaza that can threaten our southern population and beyond, that ended up being the logical objective as we sit. And work finally is underway in trying to understand what do we really want and what is realistically feasible the morning after, when Hamas is no longer there and the IDF goes home.
Do you both think that more limited goal, and Noah, I think you stated it, exactly right, which is to ensure that you have eradicated the military and governance capabilities of Hamas. Do you both think that there is a route to achieve that?
It will be very difficult and very long. And I think that's why it makes sense to take time and plan it. and not rush into a ground invasion or whatever a military offense. It's a big question, and I think the question also of, okay, so what else? What's the alternative, and how do you make sure that the alternative is not far worse? Or how do you make sure that the alternative can maybe answer some of the grievances that created Hamas from the first place? And unfortunately, I think that's a question that's still, it's starting to be discussed in Israel. And it should be, once we have some sort of a better sense of where is it going to lead, then maybe we can, engineer the reverse engineering of how do we plan this, basically this war in accordance. But yeah, I think it's a very ambitious objective. And in order, I've heard about a conversation regarding ISIS and Iraq. And also, what Al-Qaeda, how long did it take to bring down bin Laden? It took 10 years. We don't have 10 years. The Israeli economy doesn't have 10 years. So these are questions. The fact that this is happening in our backyard, this weighs heavily on the ability to really take time, plus the issue of captives. 224, I think that's the most recent number. People, Israelis, some of them are elderly and children and women and many civilians who are basically now being held by Hamas. We could, and hopefully this is what they're now doing, is trying to leverage that time in order to reach some sort of an agreement. I think any kind of agreement that would be maybe agreed upon in the near future would be probably on civilians, and then maybe in return to some fuel or one of the things that Hamas is really after. But then we will still be left with the question of soldiers. They do have, we don't know the numbers. The IDF is obviously keeping tabs on what are exactly the numbers of civilians versus soldiers, but we do know that they do have some soldiers. We also don't know what ranks. And for them, also from the initial standpoint, they talked about how this offense was in order to release their prisoners. So that's what they're aiming for, and that will be a win for them, for Hamas. So I do assess that after, if we do reach a civilian deal, then they would try to aim for some sort of prisoner swap. And that's very much going to complicate all of the scenarios, because you have to consider going into battle with the fact that you have civilian population that's also being used as a human shield.
So, Nimrod, do you think that this is a achievable goal to eradicate Hamas's military and governing capacity? And if so, could I ask you to address, if it's going to be a months and months and months process and stretch into well into next year, what does that mean for the humanitarian planning that must go on to address the other 2 million people in Gaza?
With your permission, just one more point on the hostages, because if Noah didn't make it complicated enough, I'll add another complication or two. One is that Hamas is not the only one that holds hostages. A few dozens are held by Islamic Jihad. And I don't know, I hope that our system does, whether those that were held by neither have already been gathered by Hamas, because fear for their lives is greater where they are not in Hamas' hands. Not because Hamas is a great humanitarian, it has demonstrated its brutality in ways that have not yet been fully described to you and your audience, and it'll take time before the full story comes out. But because they understand their value and they want to trade them in return for something. So at least they are safe. They are terrified. They are not treated very, very well, but they are safe. They are likely to survive. So one thing is, do we know where they are? Will they use them as human shield by spreading them out in strategic locations? But even at the bottom of it all, there is the basic contradiction between trying to negotiate their release from those that you are about to annihilate. In the past, when we negotiated, it was with a group that we tolerated. So they knew that they had a morning after. This is not the case according to the war objective. So this contradiction makes it even more complicated. As to your first question, in the best tradition of Israeli pluralism, I'll have a different take than Noah. I believe the operation will not be easy. We will take casualties, no doubt, but I don't think it will be that prolonged. It's not a matter of days or weeks, but I don't think many months. And you know, you hear it from somebody who heard an Israeli government telling the IDF to go into Lebanon for 48 hours, and we came out after 18 years. So with this grain of salt, that things could certainly go wrong and get complicated. But from everything I managed to understand, and I'm not privy to plans, I believe that the operation will be more sophisticated, more creative, with resources not seen before. I don't think there will be fighting in tunnels. I think tunnels will be dealt with remotely, and that's already started. There will be occasions when there will be a need for special operations in a specific location within a tunnel, but the overall entire city built underground by Hamas at the expense of the food and prosperity of its own population is going to be dealt with differently. So I don't think it's going to be that long, and I have confidence in the ability of the IDF to do it well. Last point on this: I don't think that last weapon and last terrorist are the objective. I mean, once you will have dealt with the main ammunition depot, weapons production facilities, communication centers, command and control centers, and primary leadership, the fact that a mid-level operative who was really a macho with his weapons and his colleagues and his comrades and his tunnels and all that is a very different person when he throws his weapon and throws his uniform and hides in his mother's home in his pajamas. So it's not the last person that, with the exception of those on the list who perpetrated the atrocities on October 7th, who are on Israel's hit list, and even if it will take decades. But in general, you know, to reach the point when Hamas does not threaten Israel, nor able to govern, you don't need to go house to the last one. And that's why I think the objective is realistic, attainable, and it will not take that long. Obviously, the question is, will those who will succeed the IDF will be willing and able to deal with the remaining isolated residual terrorist individuals, tiny small groups, but that's for your next question or not.
So let me though pick up on the humanitarian aspect, because that was, you know, a really important part of the conversation I wanted to flesh out a little bit. Whether it's a matter of a few months or it's a matter of an extended period, a very, very large number of Palestinians have been displaced and are living with next to nothing. And to do that over the course of a winter, and obviously nothing's going to be rebuilt before the spring. There is a humanitarian catastrophe in the making of epic proportions here. So where, in the context of all of the military options and tactical pieces we've been discussing, how do you assess the strategic importance for Israel, as well as the human importance for Israel, of making the humanitarian needs of the people a strategic priority? So Nimrod, let me start with you on this, and then Noah, I'll come back to you.
There's a full realization of it. It is part and parcel of the military planning. And I make a distinction between our politicians and our security establishment. The security establishment takes it very seriously. And just on the two levels that you mentioned, and you hear it directly from them. We are not Hamas. We don't starve people, and we don't bring people to the verge of starvation. So the human side of it and our moral code are there, as well as the strategic consideration that the window of opportunity to do the military operation, time is running out, the more the humanitarian situation gets worse. So there are teams in the IDF and MOD that are dealing with this issue. Now, why did I make the distinction between our politicians and our military? I'll just illustrate it. As you know, our government, unlike the war cabinet, our government is loaded with a combination of lunatics and idiots. And one of them is the Minister of Infrastructure, who announced on a day certain that he just turned the tap off of water for Gaza. No more water for Gaza. Well, the morning after, he turned it on. Even those statements are horrendous and damaging, but the security establishment has its way of explaining the facts of life even to politicians without undermining government control over the military. But they knew that they have the backing of the prime minister when they told the minister to turn it on. I'm not privy to the specifics, but as Noah mentioned, there is a great concern that part of what is being delivered for the humanitarian, on a humanitarian basis, is going to be stolen by Hamas for its own militant survival. And I think one of the reasons that it takes a little longer, and what we see now is just a trickle of what's coming out through Egypt. I think by now only 57 truckloads, when you need 100 a day. And I think you will see that ramp up over time. But what Israel is expects of the Red Cross, as well as the other humanitarian relief agencies and UNRWA and Egypt, is to find the mechanisms that minimize, you cannot stop, but minimize the trickle to Hamas.
Yeah, so I can dovetail on that. And I think a big issue in the Israeli public is the humanitarian assistance, because the hostages are seen as a humanitarian issue. And they have not been visited by the Red Cross. We don't know who's alive and who's not. We don't know if they're getting medication. Some of them are babies, some of them are elderly. We don't know how they're being treated. Nimrod talked about how some of them are being held by Hamas, some of them are being held by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, some of them were taken by Hamulot, by families, by tribes, who basically wanted to sell them. So we even don't know if Hamas has the entire group. Based on the story of, I think it was told a couple of days ago by one of the hostages who was released, she said that after the very terrible experience that she had of being taken into captivity, once she was there held by Hamas, she did receive medical attention and she was treated well. That's what she said. We also have to take into consideration that her husband is still being held by Hamas. So we don't know exactly if she was guided to say things or not. So we have to take everything with a grain of salt. But as Nimrod said, we believe that because they are, at the end of the day, they're a bargaining chip, then yes, they the price tag is higher if they're better off. But then this entire humanitarian issue is a big deal for the Israeli society, and the issue of bringing more assistance into the Gaza Strip. Also knowing, of course, that 2 million people are the majority of the Gazans are innocent civilians, but we also know that during the attack, there were a few waves. The first wave was militant, the second wave was also majority of militants, but the third wave was actually many civilians. It was women, it was even children, who some of them rampaged the houses in the Gaza envelope and took TVs and people, and some of them also killed. So there's a big difficulty in the Israeli community to do this differentiation and say, yes, the majorities of Gazans are not related to the hostilities, and therefore should be treated in a humane way. I agree with Nimrod that obviously the security system is much more sophisticated and understands also that if you want to have the durability and the longevity of having a war, as we talked about, is going to be longer than what we've seen in the past. Yes, you need to make sure that you have the backing of the international community, and obviously you would not be able to get that if you're suffocating the Gazans. And there's also a realization that humanitarian assistance is actually a tool in order to pull further south a lot of the civilians, the Gazan civilians. So just from reading, what's happening on the ground from a very early part of the Israeli attack, the counterattack, the Israeli military has called on Gazans who live northern to Wadi Gaza to go south, basically evacuating the entire city of Gaza, because that's where the military believes are most of the infrastructure. That's where it's located, because the city of Gaza is the most densely populated. And we know there's a lot of infrastructure, Hamas military infrastructure in that area. So basically, and we saw that at the first few days, the Gazan population wasn't really reacting to the evacuation calls made by the military. So actually, through the humanitarian assistance being delivered through the Rafah border in the south, that was also another way of really persuading people, okay, if you don't want to take part in the hostilities, come, you will receive aid, you will receive water, you will receive food, you will receive medications, but not in that area, because that's where it's going to get dangerous. So I think at the end of the day, they were very smart about it. And we'll see them probably ramping it up because the humanitarian needs are accumulating. But the issue of fuel is going to be, I think, kind of the linchpin and the most difficult to answer.
If I may, one more point.
Yes, sure.
I think that this morning's ground operation, which was limited objective, limited in time, and limited in scope of forces, was also an indication or a signal to Hamas, first, that there is no such thing as a moment where ground invasion begins. It's not going to be yesterday there was none and tomorrow there's everything. We're going to decide when, where, and how. Second, there is a concern, the concern developed that Hamas will use the hostages 2 at a time in order to keep postponing the Israeli so-called moment of ground operation. So the message was, we're not waiting for you. And if you have something serious, then we are open. But if you're going to promise us 2 every 3 days, 2 every 4 days, it's just not going to work. So right now, The talk is, the rumor has it, and of course I'm not privy to any real information. The rumor is that a more substantial release of hostages on a basis of humanitarian considerations is on the table and is being pursued by Qatar.
So there are a number of topics that are raised in our Q&A. There are a number of other pieces of the conversation I'd like to get to. We have about 20 minutes left, and so I'm going to pose a couple of topics to you and ask for, the most concise answers you can. And I want to start with the assessment that each of you has on the current risk of escalation in the north. And obviously the potential engagement of Hezbollah is a significant factor in the back of everyone's minds. So what is your assessment of how that looks 2.5 weeks into this and the chances of keeping this to a one-front war? I'll get to the West Bank in a second, but for right now, focused on the north and Hezbollah. So Noah, start with you and then Nimrod.
Yeah. So frankly, I think nobody really knows what's going on in Nasrallah's head. And that's one of the reasons that from the moment that this started, the IDF is not only deployed in the south, but it deployed in the north, because it was very clear that we know that they've been coordinating for the past year. And so still to this day, they're still coordinating in Beirut. So this was probably coordinated in some way, the Hamas attack. We don't know if they had planned a response by Hezbollah as a way to maybe impede some sort of ground invasion. Then we had the US coming to our aid. So we don't know exactly what was the initial plan, but at the moment, there's a question, I think, of whether or not Hezbollah would want to sacrifice itself or to really put itself on the line in order to save Hamas. That's one issue, whether or not it sees Hamas as, an essential part of his national interests. And then the other part of that question, if the answer is yes, that it's an essential part, is are they going to attack if we defeat Hamas? Or maybe are they going to attack because we're unsuccessful in defeating Hamas and basically it's a sign of weakness? So I think all cards are on the table. We have a very high level of alertness and basically preparing for the option that, yes, this could spiral also in the north. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, Nimrod.
I'll start with agreeing with Noah that we don't know. And then I will suggest speculation. And I would say that I think that there's one thing in the mind of Nasrallah that we do know, and that is his lesson from 2006. In 2006, after the war in Lebanon, the second Lebanese war, what we call, he was summoned to Tehran and was about to be fired for having risked the entire Iranian investment in building Hezbollah in order to deter Israel from attacking Iran, wasting it on an adventure of getting 2 Israeli soldiers kidnapped. He was almost fired, and then he gave an interview in Arabic in which he confessed that had he realized that the Israeli reaction would be 1% of what it was, he wouldn't have done it. I think that neither Tehran nor Hezbollah have forgotten that episode. And therefore, on the one hand, it's not just Hezbollah. I think Tehran will be very careful whether it is willing to sacrifice what is meant to be its own bulletproof vest against an Israeli assault on Iran. Conversely, can the axis of resistance, as they define themselves, allow itself to lose a territory where it is in control? What message does it send to the region? Where is the dynamics of Tehran being more and more and more aggressive and successful in intimidating and attacking Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, through the Houthis and otherwise? Will that start swinging the pendulum in the other direction. So you have a contradictory consideration. So my money is that in a strategic decision, there is no inclination to do so, and we see evidence that Hamas is very much frustrated that his partner did not show up at the moment of crisis. Where I am concerned is more with miscalculation and escalation as a result of Hezbollah trying to show that it is doing something without going too far, and Israel retaliating without going too far. And when you have this kind of a game played, it's a very, very risky proposition.
And that is precisely what we see every day. I mean, that is precisely what's happening. And the risks are enormous. And certainly I know that the Biden administration, in terms of its ranking of its priorities, this is way up there and really trying to keep an eye on every place where this is popping up and trying to tamp it down is a very important priority. Let me shift.
Look, over the past few days, Hezbollah lost 40 operatives, the largest number since the war in 2006. Palestinians were killed too, but for Hezbollah, Palestinians are dispensable. Its own men are not. So yeah, the risk of miscalculation is there, and American deterrence is a very important augmentation of Israeli deterrence.
Yeah, and it's important for our listeners to understand just, how much on the knife's edge everything is. I mean, this is really in real time, even as we're speaking here, who knows what's exactly happening. So we're really in the midst of it. Let me shift over to
it's also worth just mentioning that this axis, this resistance axis, is also, they have Shiite militias in Iraq that are, as we speak, attacking U.S. bases, and then most probably there would be some sort of reaction also from U.S. Army. Right. So I think where this escalatory dynamic is very dangerous. And none of us really know whether or not this would actually be, be leveled or stay in the same dynamic.
And I think our goal with these webinars is not necessarily to leave, the hundreds of people who listen to them and watch them with answers, but to give them the insight into the right questions to be asking and the considerations that they should be aware of as the events are unfolding. I don't think any of us would be, we all have the humility to know we've observed this for a long enough time to know we don't know the answers, but we can tell what the right things to watch are. And I hope that's what people take away from this. So speaking of that, I think it's also very important to watch the West Bank in the midst of all this. That J Street's focus has often been on the conditions there. It appears from reports that we are getting that there has been a window of opportunity open for some of the worst of the troublemakers on the West Bank to try to use this moment to, force some small Palestinian herding communities out and to take a shot here and there at people. And again, that has the risk of spiraling. And so, here again, I'd be interested in each of your take on strategically what can put yourself in an American point of view. How high a priority should this be in the American list of things it's discussing as it sits down with the war cabinet and says, keep an eye on X and Y and Z? Where's the West Bank on that list? Nimrod and then Noah.
Very, very high. And I must say I was so, it's presumptuous to say pleased about something the president said. I was very pleased when the president spoke about it, both on the phone with Netanyahu and in public. The message that some of us were trying to convey to the administration through every venue is that while those who are thinking about the morning after all say that in the end, it's the PA that will be the solution. But we may wake up before this war is over and the PA is no more. I know that crying wolf, and he doesn't show up, but one day he does. So yeah, there were threats of PA collapse. And today we face three options. If things continue as they are, that leadership will just get fed up and establish itself in diaspora, or just retire to Qatar, that there will be a public uprising against it because it does not do enough to help the miserable brothers in Gaza, or that the trend that it loses control over segments of the West Bank will just escalate, and it's not going to be just Jenin they cannot go into, and Hebron and other areas, but perhaps even lose control, effective control and governance in Ramallah. So our extremists who got a lot of energy from the fact that their leaders were selected by Netanyahu to serve in his government with relevant positions, with positions relevant to West Bank policy, and things were going from worse to worse even before this war. But as you said correctly, things are happening that are awful. The intensity, the number of Palestinians killed on a daily basis on the West Bank is increasing, and a major warning to the Israeli government that if we don't want to end up with a Gaza situation on the West Bank, we better shield the Palestinian Authority with all its flaws, corruption and incompetence and whatever, with all its flaws. We have to shield it from the prospects of collapsing one way or another.
Noah, before you start, what I'd like to do is we have about 7 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do is ask you to take the thread of the West Bank and the PA, but weave it into your thoughts on this question of the day after. And Nimrod, I'll come back to you then to close it out with your thoughts. But I think that, this is where I know there's a lot of thinking going on in your organizations, in my all of us are doing a lot of thinking about what can be put into place now. And perhaps you could share whatever initial, again, 3 minutes each, thoughts about how the PA and the West Bank fit into the day after in Gaza. Noah.
Yeah. So I want to start by first making a differentiation and what we see now in the West Bank. We do see violence of settlers against Palestinians, whether it's hurting communities or other rural communities. That's something that we've known to be happening for the past couple of years. And the the American administration has actually tried to discuss and bring up to the Israeli political echelon a few times, and unsuccessfully, because as Nimrod pointed out, those were some of their interests. And I think that's one element that is very disturbing. And I'm very glad that Biden, that the president really talked about it. And now the US kind of has some more leverage also when you consider everything that's going on. So I think that's a good advancement. But at the same time, we do have militants, Hamas militants, who have for the past few years been also working their way in the West Bank to increase their power. This is one of the threats also on the Palestinian Authority and its ability to governance. We see more of them in Hebron, we see more of them in Jenin and in Nablus. And yes, since this war has started, the IDF has arrested more than 1,000 militants, and I think 700 of them are affiliated with Hamas. Some of them are seniors, which on different circumstances, Israel would have not probably arrested because of what it would have caused in the Gaza Strip or some sort of uproar in the West Bank. And I think that's something that is necessary to do also because we want to see what was the plan. Was the Gaza attack coordinated with the West Bank? Did they have some sort of follow-up plan? So I think that's an important part. And yes, there are casualties because there are clashes between militants and the IDF. To your question about the day after, the way I see it, I would say there are 5 options, which obviously the one that's being discussed the most is the return of the PA. Frankly, I think it's very problematic, not only because the Israeli public would not be able to digest this, considering everything that's been going on these past few years in the West Bank, and the concern that the PA will not be able to really rebuild and basically rebuild the Gaza Strip, but also what's the word? Rehabilitate the Gaza Strip, to build the institutions that are needed. It can barely do so in the West Bank. So I think it's a nice dream, and it's something that we should be looking towards and thinking of how we can build this for maybe a medium term. But near future, I don't see that happening. I don't see Israel giving over the Gaza Strip clear of militants to the PA. And then there's a question, okay, so who else? Is it Egypt? Doubt it if they will do something like that. Is it Israel? I think the US would now be willing to allow that to happen, even though maybe most Israelis would want that option. You can also just, take a step back and recede and basically leave it for like a Somalia model of chaos, and basically have the Hamula to govern themselves. That's an option, which I think is a bad option. And then maybe if we start talking about it now, there is some way to convene maybe an international regional coalition with dominance of the UN and the US and Egypt and Saudi and the PA, also looking forward to how this could be modeled towards a stronger PA, both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And I think personally, that's the way I would go.
Thank you, Noah. Nimrod, final words from you.
Yeah, in my third hat that you didn't mention, and it's okay because it's under the radar mostly, ECF, the Economic Cooperation Foundation, long players in the field. We have developed a model that focuses what I call on the missing link. That is to say, we believe that not just long term, but in a year and a half after the war, the solution is the Palestinian Authority. As Noah suggested, the PA is not ready now to take responsibility and is incapable of. I read the Israeli public differently on the issue, but that doesn't matter. So we're talking about what is the missing link from the day that the guns fall silent to a year and a half later that the PA has been rehabilitated, reformed, including a very different Israeli policy on the West Bank and vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, which implies obviously a different government, which is something I believe is going to happen anyway. So assuming you have an Israeli government that thinks completely differently and does not share the two paradigms that collapsed. One is that all Palestinians are the same. Islamic militants and moderate anti-terrorists are all the same. That's one collapse. And the other one, that Israel benefits from splitting the West Bank from Gaza. And another one is that Hamas should be strengthened, whereas the PA should be weakened. So we don't have negotiations, God forbid. If all these collapse and the government comes with a completely reverse approach, we believe that a mechanism that is based on PA-driven local Gaza Palestinians interim management coordinated with the PA, backed by an inter-Arab mechanism and security force, of course, with the donor community doing its thing and so on. And we have also squared the issue of how do you resolve the issue of IDF phasing out and this mechanism phasing in, and how do you deal with future threats to security from indigenous terrorist capacities. We have packaged it all. Soon it will be ready for the public. For now, it is ready for officials.
Well, I just want to say thank you. I think this ending point is where we all will want to spend a lot more time in the coming days and weeks. I'm sure that you've put some thoughts into people's minds that we want to explore further. We'll probably reconvene for a conversation focused specifically on these questions of the day after. But for right now, I just want to say thank you so much. This hour flew by for me. I'm sure for everybody else. We're going to make this recording available on our public resource page, and really appreciate the insights that we received from Noah and from Nimrod, and we appreciate your partnership. Nimrod, ECF is very dear and near to my heart. My wife actually worked for ECF years and years ago, so I apologize for forgetting that. There was certainly no slight to the team there. Of course, very vital partners to all of us. So thank you both, and thank you to everybody at J Street for all your support and community through a difficult time. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.